Good evening and welcome to the second session of the Biography of a City, Lawrence, Kansas. This evening's lecturer is Paul Suewe, who teaches Advanced Placement U.S. History and Politics at Lawrence Senior High School. Paul graduated from Washburn University in 1972 with a BA in History, in 1976 with an MA in Education from KU, and in 1979 with an MA in History from KU. He's edited a book called Kansas Revisited, Historical Images and Perspectives, 1990. A second edition is due out this spring. He is on the executive committee of the Board of Directors of the Kansas State Historical Society, the Board of Directors of the Kansas History Teachers Association, and the History Committee of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. I know that you are going to enjoy Paul Suewe's lecture this evening. Paul?
Thank you, Dennis, and good evening. This evening, to explore with you the birth of a city and its early years of struggle. We will look at the people and the events that shaped the character of Lawrence, Kansas. Given the time constraints, we can only glimpse at the period. Of necessity, some important things are going to have to be left out. However, I hope at the end of this period to give you a general understanding of the nature and the significance, the nature of the character of Lawrence, Kansas. Now, our time frame will technically be the territorial period of Kansas, which is from 1854 to 1861. But of course, we will not strictly adhere to these parameters. First, we will look at the national political landscape that created Lawrence, and then we're going to focus in some detail on the Immigrant Aid Company, which gave birth to the city. After exploring the early town development and organization, we will explore the major events that shaped the early character of Lawrence, including the Wakarusa War and the sack of Lawrence. Now, these events will be seen partially through the eyes of individuals like Shaler Eldridge, a man who mixed politics and business and whose name is still associated with the business that he began. At this point, you're probably asking, well, what about Quantrill's raid? Well, it is significant, but two Lawrence experts on Quantrill's raid, Dick Sheridan and Katie Armitage, are going to cover this in later sessions. So what I'm going to be talking about is that period of time preceding the raid. Now, the importance of history in understanding our present and planning for our future is perhaps best stated by historian and former Librarian of Congress Daniel Boorstin, who said, interpreting the present and trying to make decisions about the future without a solid base in history is like trying to plant cut flowers. Trying to understand Lawrence at the end of the 20th century without knowing about its early people and their baptism in fire is indeed as futile as trying to plant cut flowers. History does not occur in a vacuum. Simple statement of fact that is often misunderstood and overlooked. To understand history, to give meaning to the cause of man's actions, to understand what led up to the events, and really make sense out of it, you have to understand the past. It's very difficult, in our case, to separate the history of Lawrence from the history of the United States and from the history of Kansas. Therefore, we will look briefly at America in the years leading up to the Civil War and focus on the so-called Bleeding Kansas from 1855 to 1858. It is from this cloth that the threads were pulled to weave the fabric of early Lawrence. Now, according to historian Kenneth Davis, and I quote, "Kansas was born of a moral idea, but not purely, not simply, nor exclusively," end quote. In the 1850s, the issue in America was slavery and its extension into the territories. The Kansas question was the political earthquake of its time. and the city of Lawrence in the Kansas Territory was its epicenter. Historians like Eric Corder point out that extremists held the public ear for nearly a half a century on both sides. The North, with its swaggering, pompous self-righteousness, congratulated itself on its high moral standards and never missed an opportunity to condemn the South. The South, on the other hand, was paranoid and saw Yankee plots everywhere and responded to their critics in a hostile manner. Now, most people, North and South, knew slavery was wrong. But the South, with its economy based on the slave system, was caught in a trap of its own making. Without slaves, the South could see nothing but its own decline and went to great lengths to convince itself that African Americans were not human. They had to believe this to justify slavery. According to University of Nebraska historian James Raleigh, in his book Race and Politics, Bleeding Kansas and the Coming of the Civil War, racial prejudice was as well an economic, political, and idealistic factors was the foundation for thinking about slavery in the territories. Pro-slavery men saw in extending slavery a threat to keeping the institution that preserved existing race relations. Rowley states that there is little evidence of public men taking either of an anti-extension or an anti-slavery position, of taking a position to benefit blacks. His book underscores that race is a premise for politics of the time and undertakes to show race's crippling effects in coping with the crisis. Now, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said in his old, if he could work a miracle, he knows what it would be. And it would be that he would make all blacks white and do away with slavery in 24 hours. Now let's review some of the key events leading up to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Beginning in the 1700s, there was a development of two distinct social economic systems and cultures, the North and the South. And was reinforced by slavery as a fundamental social, economic, cultural, and moral issue. While slavery was the major underlying cause, there were also ongoing political issues of states' rights and tariff nullification. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, passed after a full year of debate in Congress, was not so much a compromise as it was a stalemate. Missouri was added as a slave state and Maine as a free to keep the balance in the Senate. Also, the bill drew a line from the southern border of Missouri west through the Louisiana Purchase. Everything above that line was forever closed to slavery. Everything below that line was open. Now, far-sighted leaders realized that it was nothing more than a truce and announced the opening of a fight to the finish. Thomas Jefferson called it a fire bell in the night, the death knell of the Union. And John Quincy Adams saw it as a title page to a great tragic volume. While the first moves to end slavery came in the North at the time of the American Revolution, abolitionist activity began heating up in the 1830s. With the end of the Mexican War in 1848, option slavery in the territories became a troubling issue. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., so this was something for the North, passed a new strong Fugitive Slave Act, and allowed slavery itself to continue in the District of Columbia, something for the South. Again, putting off the day of reckoning, but this was not real, true compromise. The resentment in the North over the Fugitive Slave Act, coupled with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852, pushed the day of reckoning even closer. Thus, the Kansas-Nebraska Bill in 1854 reopened a supposedly settled issue of slavery in the territories and became the match igniting the fuse that led to violent conflict. Actually, the only hope for success of the Compromise of 1850 was to keep the question out of Congress. But the advance of technology, the growth of industry and commerce soon made that impossible. According to historian Daniel Burstein, an ironic twist of fate, the man who destined to revive slavery issue in Congress and so disturbed the delicate balance was the main architect of the Compromise of 1850, namely Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the namesake of our county. Senator Douglas wanted his home in Chicago to be the eastern terminus of the new transcontinental railway. And the only way to get a northern route was to settle the unorganized territory to give land grants to the railroads. He had a considerable financial interest in real estate in Chicago also. Now, to win Southern support needed for the passage, because Southerners would never vote for this bill, normally putting a railroad through a territory that was forever closed to slavery. Douglas, the Wizard of Compromise, concocted a special provision which would allow the territories to decide the issue. This was called popular sovereignty. This, he thought, was the only way to get the Southern vote. And while it was a great victory for the South, it led to angry protest in the North and also to the formation of the Republican Party. As historian William Zarnow points out, had wiser heads prevailed and Kansas been permitted to settle in Mary Manor, in which previous organized territories had been settled, there's probably no doubt that Kansas would have become a free state. What the Kansas-Nebraska did was to allow for pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces to meet physically and to compete with each other both in terms of numbers and righteousness over whether Kansas should become a free or a slave state. Now, a major problem with the Kansas-Nebraska bill was that it did not say when a territory could decide whether to be free or slave. As a result, there was a race for Kansas from both the North and the South, because the first to gain control and create a majority would decide the fate of slavery in the territory. Therefore, a combination of the slave law of 1850, making it a federal crime to assist in helping, making it a federal crime not to help someone return a runaway slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, and now the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which repealed the Compromise of 1820 and opened the Kansas Territory to the possibility of slavery. All of these things combined pushed abolitionist Eli Thayer into action. Eli Thayer, he was the originator and founding father actually, of the New England Immigrant Aid Company, simply called the Immigrant Aid Company, an incorporated stock company offering assistance to abolitionists from New England wanting to settle Kansas. It was a strange combination of philanthropic venture and money-making scheme where the promoters and managers believed they could make Kansas a free state and make money on the rising land values at the same time, according to historian Samuel A. Johnson. Now, Thayer's plan was to disseminate and encourage migration to Kansas to assist Eastern immigrants by getting them reduced tickets on railways and on steamships, and organizing them into travel groups. The Immigrant Aid Company would vest its capital in sawmills, grain mills, hotels, and other improvements to attract immigrants. Raising capital was difficult, but its propaganda work almost went too well. Eli Thayer Edward Everett Hale, and others traveled through New England raising money and recruiting settlers, claiming that they would raise $5 million and send 20,000 settlers at once to Kansas. They were assisted by newspapermen such as Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, William Cullen Bryant of the New York Evening Post, and Thurlow Weed of the Albany Journal, who wrote editorials supporting the migration to Kansas. The company also published pamphlets itself and encouraged people to write books promoting Kansas, like Sarah Robinson's book, Kansas, Its Interior and Exterior Life. And this was done to stimulate migration. Things began well with about 450 settlers in 1854 and 800 more the following spring going to the Kansas Territory. But by 1857, word had got back about the primitive conditions and the organized pro-slavery activity, and few came after that date. In fact, the total number of settlers to come to Kansas under the auspices of the Immigrant Aid Company was less than 2,000, of which probably a third returned to New England. However, while their numbers may be small, their influence was great for at least the following three reasons. Number one, they came mostly the first year or so, and they gave moral and physical support to those coming independently. Number two, the colonists were largely town founders, and the towns were the centers of Free State activity and defense. Number three, those associated with the company exercised an influence out of proportion to their numbers, including Charles Robinson, the foremost leader of the Free State cause, who was the first governor of Kansas, Samuel Pomeroy, one of the first two senators, and Martin Conway, the first representative to the U.S. House of Representatives, all from the New England Immigrant Aid Company. Western Missourians were especially upset by this corporate effort to settle Kansas. They saw the Kansas Territory as an extension of their land and considered those Easterners as invaders trying to take their land. Missourians also believed the propaganda and claimed that the Immigrant Aid Company had already raised $5 million and had 20,000 armed men that were coming to take it. No one better exemplified the paranoia than U.S. Senator David Atchison from Missouri, who organized armed groups of men in Missouri to drive out the invaders from Kansas. No town in Kansas better represented these fears than Lawrence. Now, the first group of settlers with the Immigrant Aid Company left Boston on July 17, 1854, for a town site to be named later. Arriving in what is now Lawrence on August 1st, the first party was carefully handpicked. It included 9 mechanics, a few merchants, a doctor, some builders, a couple of farmers, an architect, and a reporter. They were to prepare the way for others. The first meal was eaten atop Mount Oread at the site of what is now GSP and Corbin Halls, which was formerly the site of Old North College. Mount Oread was named in memory of Mount Oread Cemetery in Worcester, Massachusetts, a school founded by Eli Thayer, who was also the founder of the company. Now, a second group of immigrants arrived, numbering 114 a month later. So the two groups merged their claims together and formed a town site. And this town site stretched along the south banks of the Kansas River 2.5 miles, and south of the Kansas River about 1.5 miles. At first, it was called Wakarusa and among other names, but the founders decided on Lawrence to honor Lawrence, who was the treasurer of the New England Immigrant Aid Company and also the individual that put up all of the money for them to come out here up to that point. By the light of the stars, a group of surveyors found the meridian for Massachusetts Street, and lots were reserved for a college, schools, state buildings, and other civic buildings. Housing was one of the first major concerns, and this problem was exacerbated by the lack of a sawmill to saw timber into lumber. Their solution was to make hay tents, straight poles tied together at the top to make an A-frame and covered with prairie sod. And as you can imagine, this was a very short-term solution and not a very satisfactory one. Realizing this, the Immigrant Aid Company began construction on the Free Hotel, currently at the site of the Eldridge Hotel, to provide temporary quarters until housing could be obtained. A young woman wrote in a letter home, and I quote, "They have some 50 huts of different sizes, some built of logs, some of turf, and others of poles covered with grass, most of them uncomfortable except in pleasant weather. They have one large camp, which they call a boarding house, where they feed some 50 to 60 human beings at $2.50 a week. And in another camp, some 80 feet long, they are allowed to sleep, provided they can get any sleep. They lie upon the ground with such bedding as they happen to have, and those who have none go without, and when the weather is cold, they are anything but comfortable. The principal food in this hotel is bread and molasses with fresh beef fixed up, not cooked, in a manner I shall not describe." This settlement along the river was a combination of canvas tents, of hay tents, and of some very crude log cabins. And this is what they lived in the first months of Lawrence. Shortly after this second group arrived, Dr. Charles Robinson arrived with Dr. Charles Robinson. A group of Missourians came to make good on claims that they had at this site earlier by placing some sticks in the ground. A number of people in the Lawrence group, along with Dr. Robinson, went to meet them, and one of the members in the group asked Dr. Robinson, should they shoot to hit? Robinson replied that he thought it would be a shame to shoot at anything without hitting it. And after the Missourians heard that, they turned around and left. Now, letters to Boston explaining the precarious situation in Kansas prompted Amos Lawrence to ship Sharp's rifles to Lawrence in boxes marked books to avoid their discovery by nosy Missourians. In December 1854, a Washington writer who was admittedly pro-slavery wrote this, and I quote, "In July 1854, last I wrote you, I said Kansas would be a slave state. I am now of a different opinion. The impertinent and insolent inference of your Eastern fanatics, the colonizing, as they would have done by the hundreds, of the lowest class of rowdies to browbeat out voters and prevent fair expression of the popular will has brought this result. They have located themselves near the Kansas River, named their city Lawrence, and the number, I am told, some hundreds of voters. I have seen them. I've seen some of them. They are the most unmixed set of blackguards I have ever laid eyes upon," end quote. Now, one is struck in reading these letters how often both sides refer to the other side as being rowdy and low class. Now, the territorial period from 1854 to 1861 is politically one of the most confusing times in Kansas history. 10 men during that short period of time served as governor or acting governor of Kansas. And as you might have guessed, they had a very difficult time keeping the peace. Andrew Reeder, the first territorial governor, called for an election in November of 1854 to choose a delegate to Congress. U.S. Senator David Atchison encouraged pro-slavery Missourians to cross the border, vote illegally, and make Kansas a slave state. The border rules kept the Free Staters from voting. They voted themselves, and they stuffed ballot boxes electing a pro-slavery representative to Congress. They repeated this performance in March with an election to choose a territorial legislature. Now, this was a real important election. With only 2,905 registered voters in the Kansas Territory, 6,307 votes were cast, giving a whole new meaning to increased voter turnout. This so-called bogus election elected a bogus legislature, dominated by Missourians, which passed pro-slavery laws, including one making it a crime to help runaway slaves, punishable by death. Free Staters held their own elections, and Charles Robinson and James Lane from Lawrence to be leaders in the Topeka movement. Now, Lawrence quickly became the Free State fortress of Kansas. Missourians saw these damn Yankee abolitionists as outsiders coming to take their land and to destroy their way of life. While the political and physical environment was hostile, early citizens of Lawrence did manage to have some fun. The first festive occasion I could find in Lawrence was probably the 4th of July in the summer of 1855. It attracted people from all over the territory. Some 2,000 people joined a day of celebration. Independence Day probably was the most celebrated holiday in the West, and for Lawrence it took on a new meaning in 1855. A parade was held by two organized companies of militia in uniform, a silk flag made by the local women. Also, in the parade were local American Indians in ceremonial dress, 3 of which were on the speaker's platform, and one made a brief speech praising peace. A brass band played Home Sweet Home and Hail Columbia. Besides the music, there were prayers, the reading of the Declaration of Independence, and numerous political speeches. In the evening, there was a ball and also other small gatherings where people spoke of politics. Dr. Charles Robinson made an impassioned speech that first Independence Day that caused many settlers to realize the difficulty that lay ahead. I'm going to read part of that speech to give you kind of a flavor of the rhetoric. He declared that the people of Kansas would never submit to the invaders of a neighboring state, and continued, and I quote, "I can say to death, be thou my master, and to the grave, be thou my prison house. But acknowledge such creatures as my masters never. Thank God we are yet free, and hurl defiance at those who would make us slaves. Look who will in apathy and strife, they who can. The sympathy, the hopes, the words that make man truly man. Let those whose hearts are dungeoned up and interest or with ease consent to hear with quiet pulse the loathsomeness deeds like these. We first drew New England's air, and from her hearty breast sucked the tyrant-hating milk that would not let us rest. And if our words seem treasonous to dullards or the tame, 'tis but our native elect, our fathers spake the same. Let every man stand in his place and acquit himself like a man who knows his rights and knowing dares maintain. Let us repudiate laws enacted by foreign legislative bodies or dictated by Judge Lynch over the way. Tyrants are tyrants. Tyranny is tyranny, whether under the garb of law or in opposition to it. So thought and acted our ancestors, and so let us think and act. We are not alone in this contest. The whole nation is agitated upon the question of our rights. Every pulsation in Kansas pulsates to the remotest arteries of the body politic, and I seem to hear the millions of freemen and the millions of bondsmen in our land, the patriots, the philanthropists of all countries, the spirit of revolutionary heroes, the voice of God, all saying to the people of Kansas, do your duty, end quote. Well, as you can imagine, this speech had a profound effect on these New Englanders in Lawrence. Only a few months later, things turned very serious. A Free Stater named Charles Dow was murdered in a small community of Hickory Point, 10 miles south of Lawrence, in a claim dispute by a pro-slavery man, Frank Coleman. Dow's funeral was attended by a group of irate Free State men who vowed to get Coleman. A friend of Dow's, Jacob Branson, was held responsible for these threats, and he was arrested. Free Staters then came to his aid and rescued Branson. Until several years later, with the appearance of William Clark Quantrill, the most hated man in Lawrence, Samuel J. Jones, postmaster of Westport, Missouri. The bogus legislature appointed him sheriff of the newly formed Douglas County. When Sheriff Jones made his initial appearance in Lawrence, someone asked him who he was. "I'm the sheriff of Douglas County," he replied. "Douglas County? There's no such county around here," he was informed. Oh, yes, there is, as you will come to find out," he replied. Douglas County was outlined and named by the bogus pro-slavery legislature. The name, that of the author of the Kansas-Nebraska bill, Stephen Douglas, was hard to swallow for Free State men of Lawrence. However, they later forgot the name had been given to them by their enemies and accepted it, even though it was very difficult for them to do that in the beginning. Riley says of this time, and I quote, "Lawrence is taking on the appearance of an armed camp. Commander Lane issues his last call. We want every true Free State man in Kansas at Lawrence immediately. The citizen soldiers are quartered in and around the unfinished hotel. Earthwork forts are being thrown up at the entrances to town. One man cries out, 'It started! One of the pickets has been fired upon.' Lane declares for sending out a posse and the guilty offender and capturing the guilty offenders. Robinson begs, 'Men of Lawrence, we must have prudence. The excuse for shedding blood on our part must not be given to the invaders.' Robinson plea wins. How long will this reason continue to win over the exhortations of the dramatic Colonel Lane?" End quote. Now, this whole affair was a real slap in the face to all pro-slavery people in Missouri and to the pro-slavery sheriff in Douglas County, Sam Jones. Jones wrote the territorial governor asking for 3,000 men to maintain order. This gave the Missourians a pretext to invade Kansas and wipe out Lawrence. Some 1,500 men, all but 100 of these men were from Missouri, camped out on the Wakarusa River south of Lawrence, preparing to attack Lawrence during the first days of December 1855. 600 defenders of Lawrence armed with rifles. 200 of these rifles were Sharps rifles, which had the reputation for accuracy, long range, and speed of firing, prepared to fight to the finish to save Lawrence. The knowledge of these rifles was perhaps the strongest factors in preventing the invaders from marching on Lawrence right away. During the siege, the work continued on circular earthen forts. The largest one, constructed on Massachusetts Street, was built with logs banked with earth and surrounded by a trench. The Free State Hotel, which is now the Eldridge Hotel, was the center of activity for storing food, housing militia, and providing for a meeting place. Realizing what they were up against, 2 men were sent from Lawrence to get the governor, Governor Wilson Shannon, who tended to believe the stories that the Free Staters' crimes against Kansas were that they burned 16 houses, they threw women and children out in the cold. Actually, the Free Staters had burned one house, and that was Coleman's house. Well, they finally talked him coming to Lawrence, even though he was reluctant to doing that. And after assessing the situation, he negotiated a peace treaty which ended the so-called Wakarusa War. This treaty, plus the bitterly cold weather, according to Native Americans that lived in this area, it was the coldest winter that any of them could remember. So a combination of these things sent the Missourians home in a very foul mood. There was only one casualty of the so-called Wakarusa War, and that was Thomas Barber, a local farmer who was in defending Lawrence. He was shot and killed on his way home to see his wife by Missourians west of town. His body was brought back to town and laid out on a table at the Free State Hotel for all to see, including Governor Shannon, when they were there to negotiate the peace treaty. Thomas Barber has been called by some the hero of the Civil War, and his body is buried in Pioneer Cemetery on Daisy Hill, which would make then the Wakarusa War the opening confrontation of the Civil War. Now, Barber's murder was known nationwide and became symbolic of the whole Bleeding Kansas period. Not long after Barber's death, John Greenleaf Whittier wrote an impassioned poem entitled The Burial of Barber, published in the National Era, March 1856. And I would like to read that poem. Bear him, comrades, to his grave, never over one more brave shall the prairie grasses weep in the ages yet to come, when millions in our room what we now sow in tears shall reap. Bear him up the icy hill with the Kansas frozen still, as his noble heart below and the land he came to till, with a freeman's throes and will and his poor hut roofed with snow. One more look at that dead face of his murdered ghastly trace. One more kiss, O widowed one. Lay your left hands upon his brow, lift your right hands up and vow that his work shall yet be done. Patience, friends, the eye of God, every path by murder trod, watches lidless day and night, and the dead man in his shroud, and the widow weeping loud, and in our hearts are all his sight. Every deadly threat that swells with roar and gambling hells, every brutal jest and jeer, every wicked thought of man, plan of the cruel heart of man, though but whispered, he can hear. We in suffering, they in crime, wait the just award of time, wait the vengeance that is due. Not in vain a heart shall break, not a tear for freedom's sake fall unheeded. God is true. While the flag with stars bedecked threatens where it should protect, and the law shakes the hands with crime, what is left us but to wait? Match our patience to our fate and abide the better time. Patience, friends, the human heart everywhere shall take our part, everywhere for us shall pray. On our side are nature's laws, and God's life is in the cause that we suffer for today. Well, to suffer is divine, past the watchword, past the countersign, endure. Not to him who rashly dares, but to him who nobly bears, is the victor's garland sure. Frozen earth to frozen breast, lay our slain one down to rest. Lay him down in hope and faith, and above the broken sod, once again to freedom's God, pledge ourselves for life or death. That the state whose walls we lay in our blood and tears today shall be free from bonds of shame, and our goodly land untrod by the feet of slavery shod with cursing as with flame. Plant the buckeye on his grave for the hunter of the slave, in its shadows cannot rest, and let the martyr mound and tree be our pledge and guarantee of freedom of the West. Now, in 1871, a schoolhouse was built in the Kennewaca Township west of Lawrence, named in Barber's honor. Its restoration in the state park at Clinton has been a joint project between the KU School of Architecture and Urban Design and the Douglas County Preservation Alliance. Barber County was also named in his honor. Now, Sheriff Jones came to Lawrence in April, still mad about the Branson rescue, and he was arresting people on minor offenses. While in Lawrence, he was shot and wounded. He turned the matter over to the U.S. Marshal, who issued a call for men to come, and once again, the border ruffians answered the call and joined Deputy Marshal Fain to go to Lawrence and make some of these arrests. Sunrise, May 21st, 1856. Now recovered from his wound, prepared an assault on Lawrence from Mount Oread. 4 cannon and 800 men, including U.S. Senator David Atchison and the posse leader, U.S. Deputy Marshal Fain, came down the hill to the Free State Hotel. They hoped for resistance from the residents of Lawrence, but none was given, and 2 men named in the warrant were arrested without incident. Free State Hotel even prepared a big meal with fine wine for the posse leaders. After the arrest, Fain dismissed the posse, and Sheriff Jones took control, which went from federal control to territorial control. Jones led the posse back to the Free State Hotel and commanded Samuel Pomeroy, as the town leader, to turn over the town, which he did after a meeting of Public Safety, of the Committee for Public Safety. Jones and his men emptied the contents of the wine cellar and attempted to destroy the hotel with a cannon. However, probably as a result of their refreshment, the first cannon shot went way over the hotel and ended up in what is now Old West Lawrence. After an additional 30 shots with these cannon bounced off of the hotel with no major effect, they decided to put powder kegs in the basement. And remember, this hotel was made out of limestone. They exploded the powder kegs, still to no effect. So they went from room to room, lighting a fire in each room, and finally burned the hotel down. When the flames reached their peaks, Jones raised himself up in the saddle and addressed the crowd. "Gentlemen, this is the happiest day of my life. I to make the fanatics bow down before me in the dust and kiss the territorial laws. I have done it by God. You are now dismissed. The orders of the court have been executed." End quote. In addition to burning the Free State Hotel, they destroyed 2 newspapers, throwing the presses in the river, and they plundered businesses and burned Charles Robinson's home. The sack of Lawrence was complete. The town had been robbed, several buildings burned, and the loss was around $200,000, which was a considerable amount of money at that time. Now, why, you might ask, did Lawrence not attempt to defend itself like it had in December? Well, for one thing, it was under much different circumstances than last December. This was perhaps perceived to be more under the sanction of law, and the leaders of Lawrence, Robinson and Lane, were out. So the Committee of Public Safety decided on a plan of non-resistance. But if the pro-slavery group could have designed a better plan to hurt their cause, I don't think it would be possible. John Brown and his men were on their way to Lawrence when they received word that Jones had sacked the town. Leaving the main body of his men who were heading home, Brown and about 7 or 8 other men rode to Dutch Henry's Crossing on Pottawatomie Creek, where they hacked to death 5 pro-slavery men. The remainder of 1856 saw fighting around Lawrence, in which many of the Lawrence men were involved. As Crafton states, and I quote, "During 1856, perhaps no small community had been so much in the thoughts and on the tongues of people both north and south as the community of Lawrence. It stood as the bulwark of the Free State movement It occupied the attention of Congress. It has been burned, robbed, threatened with starvation, had on one occasion been brave in resistance, on another weakly submissive. It had sent capable representatives as well as rebel rousers back east to plead its cause. Its leaders had been imprisoned and released tardily during the year the name Lawrence had become a symbol. To some, its attitude epitomized the dogged resistance to the Union, and to others, it forebode a split and ultimate disaster, end quote. Now, no site in Lawrence or in all of Kansas is more symbolic of this Free State movement than the Eldridge Hotel. Indeed, the first Eldridge Hotel, called the Free State Hotel, is not only on the National Registry of Historic Sites, but it is our city seal. And few men, excluding politicians, have played a more important role in our city's history than Shaler Eldridge. He was not your average hotel proprietor, but a man of conviction, of action, and of perseverance. A true risk-taker, putting not only his fortune but his life on the line for what he believed. He was a man of vision who was committed to his cause, his family, his community, and his state. Massachusetts abolitionist Shaler Eldridge came to Kansas Territory in January of 1855, and he managed the American Hotel on the banks of the Missouri River in Kansas City. This was a stopping place for the company immigrants on their way to Lawrence. Eldridge came to Kansas with Samuel Pomeroy. Pomeroy was the financial agent of the Immigrant Aid Company, and on approaching the city for the first time, he felt, based on his experience in the Southwest, that a military title was best in the land of chivalry. So turning to Eldridge, he said, "Eldridge, if you address me as general, I will reciprocate by calling you colonel." "It's a bargain," he said to his friend, and after that they introduced and referred to each other with the strictest rules of military etiquette. Eldridge said, and I quote, "This reciprocal brevet proved as effectual for both of us as would official commissions, and our military titles assumed for a diversion have adhered to us throughout our life," end quote. Eldridge did join the military during the Civil War, but as a private, and served 6 months. In 1863, he was appointed a paymaster in the U.S. Army by President Lincoln and served for about a year before he resigned. Eldridge and Pomeroy followed the many to the Kansas Territory. A train from Massachusetts to Chicago. Another train to Alton, Illinois. Alton, Illinois was the western terminus of the railroad in 1855. Then a boat down the Mississippi River to St. Louis, then up the Missouri River. However, since the river was frozen part of the way, they had to get out and take wagons and stagecoaches overland to Kansas City. Now, Eldridge's first trip to Lawrence was a month later in February 1855. The first hotels in Lawrence he described as hay tents with dirt floors, poles bent together at the top, covered with sod and long prairie grass. With only 300 or 400 residents, Lawrence already had 3 weekly newspapers: the Herald of Freedom, the Kansas Free State, and the Tribune. The Free State Hotel was under construction, begun in April 1855, and by the Immigrant Aid Company. This was one of their hotels that they built. In the fall of 1855, Eldridge received a 5-year lease on the Free State Hotel, and in November, he brought his wife and 4 daughters to Lawrence, presumably to get them out of Kansas City, where he thought things were dangerous. In the early years, business and politics were very closely related. The unfinished hotel was used as a fort and headquarters during the Wakarusa War in 1855. And as I have already mentioned, the body of Thomas Barber was laid out in the hotel, and the treaty to end the standoff was also signed in that hotel. May 21st, 1856 was also an eventful day for Colonel Eldridge, as it was for the rest of Lawrence. The Free State Hotel, having survived the Wakarusa War, was finally finished on April 12, 1856, and ready for its grand opening on May 21st. This, as you already know, was the very day that Sheriff Jones burned it to the ground. Now, the Lawrence newspapers were being charged with sedition against the territorial government, and the hotel was being charged as having military use and being used to resist the law because it was said to have portholes for cannons and small arm fire. Colonel Eldridge told Sheriff Jones after he burned the hotel, and I quote, "You may burn it, but every time you burn it down, I will erect another hotel in its place, and I'll add another story to it," end quote. So true to his word, in the spring of 1857, 1 year later, he built a 4-story hotel to replace the 3-story Free State. This time, it was instead of stone, costing him $80,000 as opposed to the $20,000 for the Free State Hotel. Eldridge was out of town when Quantrill burned this hotel on August 21st, 1863, but he rebuilt it also. Of the 4 hotels that have been on that site since the beginning of Lawrence, only the current one was not owned by Shaler Eldridge. In conclusion, it is only fair to note that the situation in Kansas had both a political and an economic basis. According to Kansas historian William Zarnow, quote, "Geography dictated that Kansas would be an economic dependency of Missouri. Missouri's extension of political control over Kansas was quite natural and was not entirely related to slavery. Questions of land titles and speculation enterprises were also basic to the Kansas," end quote. Also, it should be pointed out that most of the early residents came from the middle states, especially Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And they came on their own. They were not part of this colonization effort. Most people who came after the first few years were coming for mainly economic opportunity and not for political reasons. It is important to mention that this early struggle led to even more violence during the early statehood period, with Lawrence Jayhawkers being led by James Lane, raiding Missouri towns and freeing slaves, but also looting, burning, and killing people. Of course, Quantrill got his revenge in 1863. Now, having said all of this, I still think that the New England town leaders like Charles Robinson, St. Roy, and Shaler Eldridge, just to name a few, shaped our character in such a way that it has made Lawrence unique. Education and cultural activities have always ranked high on our agenda, and in many ways, we still do things differently in Lawrence, as you will learn from subsequent presenters. Today, border ruffians may have been replaced by mall developers, and Sharp's rifles may have been replaced by Plan 95, but Lawrence continues to fight for its identity. In closing, I would like to leave you with this thought. It is something that through my teaching I try to demonstrate every day to my students. It is simple in its construction, but is complex in its meaning. And it can be stated in basically 2 words: history matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Suewe. And with that, we will conclude the tape portion of our presentation and move into a discussion. Thank you very much. Our lecturer for this hour is Dr. Michael Swann, who grew up in Leavenworth in the 50s and early 60s. He came to KU in 1968 and got a BA in Geography and a BA in History in 1972. He went on to Syracuse University from 1972 to 1977, where he received a PhD in Biography. Later then, he taught at Syracuse University, the University of Oklahoma, and the University of Nebraska. He came to KU in 1991 as Assistant Dean in the School of Architecture and Urban Design, and he is presently Associate Professor of Architecture and Urban Design and was promoted to Associate Dean of the School of Architecture and Urban Design. Among many of his publications, he has 2 books, Tierra Andreto, Settlement and Society in Colonial Durango, and Migrants in the Mexican North, Mobility, Society, and Economy in a Colonial World. I'm happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Swann, for this second portion.
Thank you, Dennis. It's really nice to be talking about the Northern Hemisphere for a change, and I'll try not to stray to Mexico. It's a real privilege to grow up in Leavenworth and have the opportunity to talk about what's good and what's not so good about Lawrence. I'll try to stick to the good tonight and forget my Leavenworth origins. My approach tonight is going to be more like a class, I think, and so if I'm a bit informal, I hope you're not bothered by that too much. I consider this to be, as Dennis said, a course on the biography of a place, and in that sense, I think we need to look at the built environment, which I'm looking at tonight, of Lawrence as its anatomy as such, and changes in the anatomy of Lawrence, that is construction, demolition, renovation, expansion, and those sorts of things, have in Lawrence, as elsewhere, been preceded either by a change in the context that surrounds Lawrence, that is the demographic, the national population trends, the economic context of Lawrence, or they have been preceded by some kind of significant local event, such as a flood, fire, or tornado, as you'll find out. So there seems to be a recognizable cause and effect that helps account for the changing face and shape of Lawrence, particularly as we see it today. For this reason, I'm going to follow a chronological approach tonight in describing how Lawrence has become what it is today. This will allow us, I think, to identify layers of the landscape and to understand recent processes of spatial expansion in Lawrence and what they mean for the identity of this town. And I'm also going to follow a very visual approach tonight, so you're going to have to spend most of the evening with your eyes on the monitor, because when you talk about the built environment, you want to see landscapes. The limitation of this approach is that I can't go into a lot of detail tonight on individual buildings, on unusual neighborhoods, or notable builders and developers. All I can do is describe for you big trends and changes. And let me get the first slide up here. And we're fading into, let's go a little bit to the first slide. There goes the TV show. First slide. Let's keep heading back. Well, there we go. This is a little outline of what I want to cover. And what I plan to do, once I find the pointer here, is begin with what has been termed the settlement period in Lawrence history. This is what Paul touched on tonight, and that covers 1854, 1863. We'll then look at the built environment in Lawrence after Quantrill's raid, 1864 to 73. Move on to the last quarter of the 19th century, the industrialization period, when lots of new buildings were constructed. 1900 to 1915 is kind of an important period in Lawrence's built environment history. There are a number of crises that affect particularly the downtown. 1916 to 1945, I call that a period of settling in when it's on the flavor and feel of a real Midwestern college town. 46 to 63, the post-war boom. Things start to change a little bit during the Eisenhower years. And then 64 to 79, building for the boomers. That's when I think Lawrence really started to turn the corner and go from being a town to a city. And then we'll look at the events 1980 to the present, and I've labeled that metropolitanization. I made up a good word for that one, because I think what happened then has a lot to do with Lawrence being pulled into the Kansas City metropolitan area. Then I'll end up with a conclusion and a little bit of a note and discussion on the sources that I've used and that you'll see on the monitor tonight. Let me present a kind of a standard theme for all this. I think Lawrence is very unusual in that it's had this recent pattern of explosive growth after well over a century of very little growth. But I think Lawrence is following a fairly predictable pattern now in the late 20th century. And to establish a theoretical context for what we're going to be looking at, let's take a look at one very simple and very old model of urban growth. And you've probably seen this before in a textbook or in some other kind of class. Normally when we talk about urban growth, we talk about cities in North America advancing from a pedestrian stage, a small 3-mile radius thing where people can walk from one place to another in the 19th century, to a larger, slightly larger city that's governed by horse and buggy. And then cities usually expand when the railroad comes, and they follow rail lines and other arterials out from the center, get a little bit bigger because transportation and access is easier. And then in the 20th century, with the advent of the automobile, they start to follow freeways out, and they grow considerably in size. Finally, in the mid-20th century, with suburbanization after World War II, many cities in the United States grew to very large entities, and what we see today are these enormous things on the landscape, ringed by an outer beltway with these edge cities that surround the cities already reached that point. My contention tonight is to show you how we got to this point. What you're looking at right now on the monitor is a satellite image from 1991 that shows over here the Kansas City, Missouri built-up area, the Missouri River coming down like this, the car running over here. And in the corner of the satellite image over here, there's a slightly blue-gray image that's connected via K-10 over to Johnson County. What this shows is that physically, Lawrence has been integrated into the Kansas City metropolitan area. We are one with that metropolitan entity. And my point tonight is that Lawrence is becoming more and more connected into a larger urban system, and its built environment reflects this. The process of integration, I think, offers great opportunities, but it also challenges the town's identity and its character. So let's start by looking at the first period, 1854 to 1863, which is commonly termed the settlement period. Paul covered, I think, the interesting stuff here, that which has to do with the people and personalities in Lawrence in the 1850s. That is the human part of settlement. What I want to look at is the built environment, the physical Lawrence, as it has been portrayed and discussed and described in the past. First, let's talk a little bit about the significance of Lawrence's early location. Much of the reason the town took off and flourished was its situation with respect to all of the paths and trails that crossed Kansas territory. This is an 1837 painting entitled Crossing the Kaw. And crossing the Kaw in the 1830s and 1840s was not an easy task. The locations of ferries often stimulated town growth. So if you had a ferry, you attracted settlement normally. And that same difficulty existed after the 1830s and 1840s. This is a bull train crossing the Smoky Hill River farther west, an even shallower river that should have been easier to cross. Wagon traffic was significant. It created opportunities at crossing points for merchants and others to establish a basis for trade. The ferry at Lawrence, shown in this depiction in 1857, attracted great use and became a very important tool for creating trade for the city, and was still important, as this picture shows, in the 1870s for getting across the river and taking large loads across the river. So that's an important determinant, a geographic determinant of Lawrence taking off in the 1850s. Also, Lawrence was well situated to capture Kaw River traffic and to establish links with major trails. This is a map from the Fremont Party drawn in 1846, and it shows a number of these great trails that crossed Kansas out on plains and paralleled the Kaw River. Lawrence was situated pretty much in the center of this mass of braided trails that progressed westward. This included the Santa Fe Trail, which runs across the southern part of the map, ran across Douglas County into the 1850s, as well as the Oregon Trail, which cut across Douglas County and northwestward. So there was a large network of trails that crossed Kansas that created or led to the creation of a large trade hinterland for Lawrence. And this included a number of smaller local roads that focused on Lawrence in the 1850s. The diagram that I've got up on the monitor now shows trails north of the Kaw that existed in the 1850s that linked Lawrence with Quindaro, with Leavenworth, with Atchison, and other river towns on the Missouri, and also connected Lawrence directly to Topeka, and most importantly to the Rhett Lane Trail, ran up into Nebraska, Iowa, and into Free State territory. So Lawrence had a real locational advantage with the river and the trails from the beginning. The town of Lawrence was founded by the New England Emigrant Aid Company, as Paul pointed out, in 1854. It was surveyed and platted by A.D. Cyril. We'll jump right past the steamer Lightfoot of Quindaro and jump to the 1854 plat of Lawrence. The plat, as shown here, was drawn in a grid. That reflected the speculative purpose of Lawrence from the very beginning. Like other western towns, it was speculative in nature. It followed the Philadelphia model. It was drawn up in a fashion so that lots could be disposed of, could be sold very quickly and very easily. Here in Lawrence, we were talking about 50 by 117-foot lots, 80-foot wide streets that were standard by survey. Everything was standardized for rapid sale and disposal. Unlike the New England, which was organic, which was irregular in form, and which many of the New England Immigrant Aid migrants, at least who came from that region of the country, left behind. The initial growth of Lawrence within this framework was predictably haphazard, chaotic, and fairly normal for a frontier river town in the 1850s. Makeshift multi-purpose buildings, again, as Paul has pointed out, predominated on the landscape in 1855. They were constructed in irregular fashion and built mainly as temporary structures near the landing itself. This 1856 drawing shows buildings of various materials: sod, log, canvas, even thatch. The construction boom in town building hit just about everywhere along the Kaw and the Missouri in the mid-1850s. And again, this is pretty standard to have this kind of a pattern dropped on the landscape. Leavenworth had the same kind of construction boom in the mid-1850s as well. So this is then a revised version of a town plat for Lawrence that was produced in 1858. And you can see that that larger plat has been reduced in size. The town plan was altered somewhat. There were modifications to features such as parks, alleys, and so on. Commercial blocks were elongated, which emphasized commerce on Massachusetts Street in the end. And so modifications were made in this first period of settlement to the framework itself as well as to the built environment, to the constructed built form that was in Lawrence. Commercial buildings soon started clustering in the center of town next to the landing. And by 1858, this is the standard view of Lawrence that most of you have seen, there was a considerable massing of structures along one block of Massachusetts Street. I think you can see Massachusetts clustered right in here, the 600 and 700 block of the street. The rest of the settlement was fairly dispersed over the grid with typically low buildings, little verticality, and of course many false buildings, as you'd find in any frontier town at that time. That's verified again by the 1858 view of Lawrence from the opposite direction from Mount Oread, which shows the same pattern. There are very few distinguishing landmarks in these first few years because the landscape's in constant flux. If we look at Massachusetts Street, at the commercial buildings on Massachusetts Street in 1860, then we see that these were fairly standard in size and shape. Note the unregulated signage along the street, the mud, wheel ruts, the unregulated traffic, the residential land use mixed in the back there. You see the side gable on the house. Again, that's very typical of mixed commerce and residential in a frontier town Main Street. By the 1860s, there were also significant other buildings outside the commercial center of the town. Here's a house at 743 Louisiana. There are a number of large merchant homes like this constructed on the west side of Massachusetts Street. This predates Quantrill's raid. East of Massachusetts, in what became the working class neighborhood of early Lawrence, there were other smaller but substantial frame and brick homes to be found, like this one at 913 Pennsylvania. And besides these residences, there were many frame hotels and other buildings scattered around town, particularly near the landing and near the center of Lawrence. So by 1859, we have this view. You could see the Eldridge House in the lower left corner there, the Unitarian Church, giving Lawrence at least the start of a skyline in its first 5 years. This early growth, however, temporarily ended in August 1863 with an event that's going to be discussed later on in class, and I'm speaking, of course, of Quantrill's raid. The downtown, at least, was devastated, as has been shown in many depictions. The Eldridge House was left in ruins and had to be completely rebuilt. So Lawrence's early heritage was lost, but it had the population, the capital, framework to construct a more unified Main Street that would lack this kind of architectural variation found in a typical frontier town. This brings us to the second phase in the built environment history of Lawrence. That's the period that's commonly called city building, 1864 to 73. This is a very brief period during which the essential character of the downtown was established. Three things led to the boom in construction that occurred in the 1860s. First, the obvious need to rebuild after Quantrill's raid. Secondly, the arrival of the railroad. And thirdly, a big jump in population. The population explosion that took place in the 1860s was absolutely amazing. Nothing like it happened in Lawrence during the rest of the 19th century. These are simple population figures for the city totals. 1860, you can see there were 1,645 souls in Lawrence, as Katie pointed out in the first Q&A session. By 80, the number had increased by fivefold to over 8,000 people, and only up to 10,800 by 1900. So there's a big demographic explosion in Lawrence in the 1860s. This created a huge demand for housing, and it provided Lawrence with an abundant supply of laborers. The other key event, of course, is the arrival of the railroad in 1864 and the connection of Lawrence to other places in the region. This is absolutely critical. The bridge across the Kaw was completed in 1863, and significantly this connected Lawrence and North Lawrence. That's important because North Lawrence, shown in this 1865 plat, was a rail center in the mid-1860s. The Union Pacific Railroad ran north of the river. Now, Lawrence had all kinds of visions of capturing rail traffic from east to west, but it lost out to Kansas City, just as Leavenworth unfortunately did in the 1860s. But the was that Lawrence had to create some connection to Kansas City and to Leavenworth to become part of the trade. So you can see the map here shows the connection between Kansas City, the proposed connection, and the Kaw Valley. What happened to save Lawrence, of course, was it had a linkage with Leavenworth created in 1867 when the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston made its way south to Lawrence, crossed the Kaw, and gave Lawrence a direct north-south line that linked it north to Leavenworth and south into Baldwin. The Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston tracks remain today on East 14th Street, and they, again, stand as sort of an artifact, a reminder of these early connections that Lawrence had. They ran south out of East Lawrence to Baldwin and then on south. Also in 1870, the Santa Fe Railroad made its way along the south side of the Kaw, and this depot was constructed on the south bank of the Kaw, giving Lawrence full connections, east, west, north, south. This promoted growth. In the downtown, the rebuilding of Massachusetts Street became a major undertaking during the city building period. Here you see Massachusetts Street in 1864. Note the stone and brick building on the right, the mud, the sidewalks, and other improvements, I suppose, over the early 1860s and 1850s. A view of Lawrence in 1869, again, when you recall the one from 1858, shows you just how much things changed in a very short period of time. Look at the link to North Lawrence, denoted by the bridge, the railroad coming in from the east, the very compact downtown with the beginning of neighborhoods on either side of it, and development on the fringes of the grid. Lawrence was ready to take off. Again, a view of Lawrence from Mount Oriat from the same direction in this point verifies or validates what was shown in the bird's eye view. This is a 1967 photo taken by Alexander Gardner, a famous photographer who visited Lawrence in 1867. And it again verifies that lack of verticality in the early years, the sparse development outside the downtown. It's not to say that there weren't significant structures in Lawrence at this time. This is the Bromelsick House in East Lawrence, across from the German Turnhalle. This is a very substantial structure. There are other significant buildings like it in both East Lawrence and West Lawrence in the 1860s. Most of the structures in East Lawrence were more like this building on New Hampshire in the 900 block. Frame, Italianate, very elegant, very attractive structures, typical of what was built after Quantrill's raid. Not everything was happening south of the Kaw. There was also construction, of course, in North Lawrence. This is the Lindley Building on Locust Street in North Lawrence. Again, a typical Italianate commercial building, a very simple box-like structure. It underwent multiple uses in its early years and into the 20th century as well. It was very active. And of course, there were landmarks that were constructed in the 1860s too. The Dutch windmill above 9th Street, built in 1863, which was an important visual landmark, not just in bird's eye views, but also in photographs and other images of Lawrence at the time. Sparse settlement on the fringes remained the rule, though, in this city building period. Mostly small farmsteads ringed the built-up part of town. This is a view east of Lawrence from Mount Oread, looking over what would be 14th Street running east today. You see these fringe farmsteads scattered about. The view southeast from Mount Oread shows even less settlement. This is looking down toward what would become Haskell Institute, or the site occupied by it. And if we look directly south into one of Alexander Gardner's 1867 photographs, south from Mount Oread, you can see again a more built-up settlement pattern of small farmsteads running along the road to the Wakarusa Valley. Again, lots of houses here, a dense cluster of farmsteads probably producing for the local market. So this compact pattern of settlement that grew up before the Civil War was rebuilt immediately after the war, and the basic layout of the downtown was set for at least the next 100 years in the 1860s and early 1870s. Beginning in the mid-1870s, we enter what could be called Lawrence's industrialization period. The period at the end of the 19th century had relatively slow growth compared to what preceded it in the 1860s, particularly with regard to demographic change. But the town spread out quite a bit, largely because of the new university in Lawrence and also because new utilities and improved infrastructure made expansion quite easy and very possible. The key feature that marks the built environment of Lawrence in the second half of the 19th century is expansion beyond the 1858 plan. This is a map that shows occupied and annexed Lawrence in 1900, shown by the outer black boundary, as compared to the area included in the 1858 plan outlined in yellow. It's fairly visible here. And you can compare the two. More important than that, or probably more attractive than that, is this 1880 view of Lawrence, which again, recall the 1869 view, which showed a fairly good-sized city. But look at Lawrence in 1880. See tremendous growth, particularly in the form of infilling in between lots, particularly in the downtown, but also in the neighborhoods that flanked it, east and west. And there is a tremendous amount of growth then after 1874 in the area south of 14th Street, beyond South Park. Look at the two bridges that are shown on the plan as well. The Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston bridges depicted here. Now, during this period of expansion, as I said, population grew more slowly than it did in the early years. Lawrence was no boom town like other cities in Kansas were into the 1870s and 1880s. You can see the early boom leveled off in the 1870s. The curve sort of plateaus here and doesn't pick up until the 1880s, toward the end of the century. And the growth rate slowed equally for foreign-born residents of Lawrence and for African-American migrants coming into Lawrence, including exodusters. Lawrence was becoming a fairly civilized town, and there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to read this graph, I fear, but that's okay, or this table, because I can tell you, maybe if I blow it up even more. This is a table that shows two things in Kansas towns and other cities of the West in the late 19th century: houses of prostitution and saloons. And I'm somewhat ashamed to admit this, but Lawrence had no houses of prostitution as opposed to Leavenworth's 6 houses in 1880. And Lawrence had 18 saloons compared to Leavenworth's, it's 3 digits, 120 plus saloons in the same year. And the populations weren't that much different in size. So there's a significant difference that's forming already in the 1880s that separates those two wonderful places in Kansas. Population growth, industrial growth, and manufacturing created a demand for utilities in Lawrence at the end of the 19th century, and we see a response to that in construction, in city building, if you want to call it that. First of all, there's a gas works that's created east of downtown in the 1880s, situated next to the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad, shown here. At about the same time, Lawrence's first water plant is built next to the river. And most importantly of all, the Bowersock Mill and Power Plant, along with its electric turbine, which you read about in the required readings for tonight, was located, constructed in the heart of what was going to become Lawrence's industrial district next to the bridge downtown. All of these created resources for public consumption. Other industries, however, rose up to serve a private market, putting Lawrence on the map as a national manufacturing center. For example, the Consolidated Barbed Wire Company grew up in the 1880s next to the Bowersock Mill. The Wilder Shirt Factory, shown here and shown in many other photographs that you see tonight, also developed in the industrial district and reached out to a national clientele and market. And equally, other mills, factories, and depots were built during the last quarter of the century. Some of these served only local consumption of goods and services, but they created a very strong manufacturing base for Lawrence and created many jobs for people who lived in East Lawrence and many companies for people who lived in West Lawrence. Now, while all of this is going on, of course, the character of Massachusetts Street changed somewhat. 1870s Massachusetts Street looked like this. It was unregulated, unpaved, and wide open. And again, this is typical for a frontier town at the time. By the 1890s, however, it starts to get a little bit more structured, regulated form. There are tracks for horse-drawn streetcars. There's a regulated, somewhat regulated traffic flow pattern here. You can see sidewalks laid out as well. And by 1900, Lawrence is really starting to look like a significant, established Midwestern town with the Merchants National Bank at the site of Tellers shown on the right side of the picture here. It's an imposing figure. Created, again, the start of a good skyline for Massachusetts Street by the end of the 19th century. Another view going back to the 1880s shows, again, competing traffic was a real problem on Mass Street. And again, by ordinance and policy, these things were slowly eliminated. But again, there's a lot of congestion to deal with. This view, again, of the Merchants National Bank, 1900, shows a streetcar and shows that the confusion was elevated above the street to this mass of overhead wires as utilities flocked in to serve the population and to distribute power and other resources. Retail also began to flourish downtown along with other services. This is the interior of a haberdashery in the 1880s. And other specialty shops like this confectionery on South Massachusetts Street were common and had, again, the market that they needed to survive here. So the face of Massachusetts Street was pretty much set by the end of the 19th century. Again, this is something very difficult to see. It's a drawing of the east and west side of the 700 block of Massachusetts Street. And what we have here essentially is a simple pattern. Simple two-story, two-part commercial on each block, and on the ends of each block then much larger, more significant, more visible anchor buildings. Again, typical pattern for Massachusetts Street that gives it a lot of visual order and makes common sense of it for all of us. Those buildings were typically Italianate, but again, there's a mix of styles to be found in the late 19th century, like the simple, or not so simple, Queen Anne buildings that could be found with brick and sometimes ironwork facades along Massachusetts Street. Even these Romanesque style buildings, such as you find at the Watkins National Bank and Community Center today, which give, again, Massachusetts Street its own identity and flavor. And even classical revival structures were mixed in. So it's a very interesting place that has its own identity, unlike what you'll find in many other towns in eastern Kansas at the same time. Again, this may be difficult to read from your seats, but it's a graph showing building materials. And basically what happened was the same thing that happened in other frontier towns that survived. Those wooden frame buildings from the 1860s and 1870s were replaced by brick as they caught fire. Fire was the main thing that changed the look of Main Street in these towns in the late 19th century. And the dark black bar shown on the left is the number of brick buildings along Massachusetts Street. The next bar over is the number of frame and stone buildings and so on. And you can see Massachusetts Street has a predominance of brick buildings, and so do Vermont and New Hampshire streets that flanked it. We can also look at building type by function as this graph shows. And again, what's happening on Massachusetts Street, the dark bar shows commercial buildings, The other bars show other types of buildings, mainly residential. What happened by the end of the 19th century was all the residential and other uses, institutional, were being squeezed out. So there's this change in function and form that takes place over the late 19th century on Massachusetts Street. It gives it, again, it's an identity. Beyond the downtown, neighborhoods thrived then on both sides of Massachusetts Street in the late 19th century. This is an 1870 view from one of the tops of a building down on Massachusetts Street toward Old West Lawrence. Note the large homes that started to fill in west of the park along Vermont. Now, not all of them were quite as grand as the house owned by George Innes, then the Loomis House today, but this is typical of some of the large Queen Annes that were built during this industrial period. There are also many neighborhood groceries to be found. This one was located south on Kentucky in what is today the Oriad neighborhood. Yet not everything was quite as improved as some of the residences and lots that could be found in Old West Lawrence. This is 9th Street looking west. You see the windmill hovering over 9th Street on the left side of the photo, and below it, again, a very, very difficult 9th Street unpaved, again with the marks of wagon wheels and so on, but power lines extending out west, infrastructure spreading along ahead of road improvement in the late 19th century. Here's a look at the northern part of East Lawrence over Liberty Hall in the late 19th century. Again, the area around the industrial district filled in pretty quickly. People wanted to live there because it's a short walk to work, as it was in every industrial city at the time. We can look again in the 1870s to the southeast, and you see the southern part of East Lawrence. Again, there's a lot of infilling that's taken place here. German neighborhood had filled in significantly during the 1870s, and it's beginning to take on again the flavor of a crowded, growing, bustling Midwestern town. Focused on institutional structures like the German Community Center here, the Turnhalle, in the 1860s, 1870s, and on. Now, there were other developments on the fringe of the city at this time. This is an 1890s view to the southeast, and I'll zoom in as much as I can. It shows Haskell Institute sitting out there on its own, separated somewhat from the rest of Lawrence. This is a closer view of Haskell at the same time, 1890s, and you can see it had this desolate environment that surrounded it. In the northeast, the northern and eastern corner of North Lawrence, there was Bismarck Grove, a place where chautauquas were held, picnics and so on, large park in North Lawrence that was very popular for 20 to 30 years there. So things were happening both in the center of the city and on the fringe in the late 19th century. The pattern was pretty simple, though, during this last 25 years. There's intensified development and infilling downtown, slow and continued expansion of the neighborhoods themselves, and then low-density development on the fringes, mainly in the form of parks and cemeteries and those sorts of things. And I think we're ready to change trays here and move on to the next basic break in Lawrence's city building period, which would be the start of the 20th century. The period roughly 1900 to 1915. This is what I termed a period of crises and rebuilding. By 1900, Lawrence had a little over 10,000 residents, as that earlier chart showed. It had a growing base of manufacturing, some very well-maintained neighborhoods, and a solid downtown. At the turn of the century, there was limited new construction downtown, while some retail businesses started to pop up along 9th Street, closer to the university. They were responding to the growing market there around 9th and Mississippi. Most of the building that took place, however, at the start of the century was with some kind of a disaster, either a flood, fire, or tornado. Now, the 1903 flood that struck Lawrence was responsible for much of the rebuilding that took place in North Lawrence and in the central business district. Flooding was a problem in 1903, 1904, 05, 08, 1910, 1912, and 1915. But the 1903 flood was devastating. It hit all of the towns along the Kaw, and these photos show devastation and destruction in Topeka, in Manhattan, and in Kansas City, as well as in Lawrence. North Lawrence, however, was hit the hardest. Here's a view of North Lawrence from the south side of the river And you can see that a new channel was cut across the earlier bend in the river, right across North Lawrence. The bridge was wiped out. It connected South Lawrence, South Bank over to North Lawrence. And there was tremendous erosion along the bank of the river. You can see, again, this is a view to the south from North Lawrence that shows the devastation and the destruction there. It cut right through the commercial district of North Lawrence. You can see buildings that were toppled here, lost entirely to the flood. This, again, might be equally difficult to follow, but it's a Sanborn map, fire insurance map from the early 20th century that shows Bridge Street, which is today North 2nd Street, in that little commercial district along Bridge Street in North Lawrence. This would be Johnny's Tavern here, and the bank of the river was cut back to this line right here by the 1903 flood. It was farther south and west before that. So the landscape was altered pretty significantly by that flood. The Union Pacific tracks in North Lawrence were ripped apart. A handful of buildings were back in business immediately, and this is the story over and over again in North Lawrence. And at the same time, a new bank was cut on the south side of the bend in the Kaw River. And you can see, again, the channel cut here in the old bank as well. There's less damage to the industrial district on the south side of the river. This is the consolidated barbed wire building next to the Bowersock Mill. It was essentially undamaged by the flood. In 1905, there's another disaster that strikes the city. The windmill above 9th Street burned down, and Lawrence lost one of its key landmarks. 1911 was a pretty tough year as well. It started with the loss of the Bowersock Opera House down at 7th and Massachusetts, lost to fire. Also in 1911, a tornado struck in the heart of the central business district and destroyed a number of buildings in the 600 block of Massachusetts Street. This is the east side of the 600 block, and you can see the swath of the tornado cutting right through the center of the block. The Wilder Shirt Factory is shown in the back there toward the river. We can take another view looking at the other side of the street, the west side of the 600 block of Massachusetts. These buildings were not hit quite as hard. But again, these are things that caused, again, a re-alteration or an alteration, a change, a rebuilding of the face of downtown Lawrence. While all this was going on, the city continued to improve its infrastructure, mainly in public transportation. An electric streetcar system was introduced in 1905, and many streets were paved and other roads were improved and graded in the early 20th century. This is a shot showing the electric streetcar line on Massachusetts Street. Again, note the overhead wires. They're not too visible here. They were used to guide the cars. In 1908, crews were busy at work ripping up bricks in the streets so that tracks could be laid. In 1912, this is a view looking down Louisiana Street from Winthrop or 7th Street as it cut across Louisiana. Some of the streets were in very good repair. West Lawrence had some fine streets. It also had some streets that were not so fine in the early 20th century. You've already seen 9th Street from below. This is looking down 9th Street from above with a little bit of snowfall on it. It was still in pretty bad shape in the early 19th century, or early 20th century. It needed regular grading as well. In fact, drag teams were brought in to keep the streets in good repair until they were eventually paved. This is a drag team, as the caption would note, that operated in Lecompton. All towns had good road days, and Lawrence had many good road days in its early years. So in summary, the first 15 years of the 20th century witnessed the loss of some key landmarks and some real setbacks to businesses downtown and in North Lawrence. But the merchants bounced back quickly, and real progress was made with street improvements in the neighborhoods. 1916 to 1945 was a period I call settling in. These are the decades between World War I and World War II. This is when Lawrence really took on the flavor of a small Midwestern college town. The university really started growing considerably after the turn of the century, and during the decades between the wars, we start to see the impact of the automobile on the landscape, the impact of electric streetcars on neighborhoods and on the downtown, and thirdly, the evolution of distinct types of neighborhoods, mainly university-oriented neighborhoods in Lawrence. First of all, there were some important changes, again, in the look of downtown. The new bridge that was torn down in the end of the 1970s was completed in 1917. And again, you see it in this slide cutting into the industrial district on the south side of the Kaw. Massachusetts Street in the 1930s had the look of a completely different landscape, a very cold, hard surface in this case, all paved, parallel parked cars in the 1930s, without any of the green, soft landscape and streetscape improvements that we have on Massachusetts Street today. Here's a view on the right of the Eldridge House Hotel in 1941, again showing you the same sort of automobile landscape that evolved in the early 20th century. Retail businesses in downtown Lawrence between the wars started showing a real university orientation. Here's Wolf Brothers Clothing Store, the interior of it in Lawrence. They also had a university shop in Norman, Oklahoma, and 2 or 3 others throughout the Midwest. But Lawrence was a prime market for higher-priced retail goods. Important anchor stores such as Round Corner Drug achieved a real identity in downtown Lawrence during this period. And stores such as Weaver's Department Store, shown here in 1938, gave the downtown a kind of a cosmopolitan feel, made it feel like a much larger city than it actually was. Buildings along New Hampshire reflected the new automobile culture that was developing in Lawrence at the time. This is the Phillips 66 station on New Hampshire. It still stands. Very attractive building. And we can look again at another building that gave Lawrence a different kind of feel, different kind of orientation, the Granada Theater, that gave the signal that Lawrence had a downtown life. It had an entertainment center. It was becoming a destination point down on Massachusetts, more than just a simple retail center, a place where you got business done. Secondly, the neighborhoods became more directly linked to downtown because of the streetcar lines that ran from Massachusetts Street out to them. This is an aerial view in 1937. I'll zoom in on it a little bit. That shows built-up Massachusetts Street in the center. You can see the commercial buildings running north-south, and then some significantly infilled or well-built-up neighborhoods flanking it both east and west. This may be maybe not so much as I thought, but I've put together a series of maps here taken out of a research report done some years ago for Professor Domer by a student in one of his seminars. And I think they're interesting because they show, by use of those red dots along the grid, the location of grocery stores in Lawrence at 4 different intervals, 1900, 1910, 20, and 30. And what they tell us is the whole pattern of commerce was affected by the extension of these electric streetcar lines throughout the city. Here's the pattern of dots in 1900 showing you where grocery stores, corner grocery stores, were to be found in the neighborhoods. By 1910, the pattern starts to change a little bit. The stores that were not located along streetcar lines start to disappear. And by 1920, there's a very close correspondence. You can see them lined up north to south in East Lawrence, where they had to follow the streetcar line to stay in business. By 1930, in West Lawrence, you can see the streetcar lines running out into the northwest there, and the series of dots at streetcar lines there. Again, transportation, the framework of transportation, guided development, guided successful commerce. It's very, very important in city building here in Lawrence as well as other places. East Lawrence continued to grow between the wars as a working class neighborhood with very strong institutions. Again, added to that rich mix of Italianate, Queen Anne, and other houses to be found in East Lawrence in the late 19th century were very many bungalows that were constructed in the 1930s. Here's an airplane bungalow that was built during this period, giving that neighborhood a very rich housing stock, and I think Dale Nimz is going to talk about this later in the course. Other important institutional structures were constructed in the 1930s. New York School, shown here in 1936. The AME Church served as a focal point for African Americans in East Lawrence. It was built in 1910. It still stands as a very important structure there as well. West Lawrence was mainly the neighborhood of the merchant class. It flourished. This is a view down Tennessee Street. Broad brick streets with wide public spaces, well-maintained, well-cared for, were a hallmark of West Lawrence in the early 20th century. Streetcar tracks running up Mississippi linked Old West Lawrence to the university, and again gave it an important connection and gave value to the housing and other institutions to be found there. North Lawrence retained its commercial center despite all of the problems in the earlier decades. This is a view of North Lawrence across the bridge. It was linked in the 1930s, but as anybody who's lived in Lawrence for a long time knows, North Lawrence was always a very separate town in the 20th century. It goes back to the disconnection in the 19th century. This is a photo of North 2nd Street, the commercial center of North Lawrence. It shows no underpass, the one that we're used to seeing to drive into North Lawrence, and it shows on the left what is today the location of Johnny's Tavern. That building had many, many, many different uses going back to the 19th century. It changed hands almost every other year with different grocery stores and other types of businesses moving in. The Union Pacific Depot was pretty much the focal point of North Lawrence. Here it's shown in the 1920s. And the grain elevators that came in the early 20th century really gave North Lawrence some visual character and added to the landscape. And again, between the wars, the Lindley building on Locust Street survived because it adapted to different uses. Here in the 1930s, it's the home of a drugstore. It was a post office and grocery store in the early 19th century and many other things. In the university area, here we're looking at the stadium from the northwest and looking into the southeast. A number of different residential sites started popping up in the 1920s. This 1937 view shows us some single-family framed homes to the southeast of the campus. And those are, of course, still standing. It's a very viable neighborhood today. But also in the late 1920s, the West Hills neighborhood, west of campus, took off. And that subdivision was linked directly to the university. And as I said, new neighborhoods are created during this period with a connection to the university and the university community. There were equally important developments to the south and east of the campus. One of the most important, most interesting was the subdivision of Breesedale. This is a view of the intersection at, let me pop back, the intersection at 23rd and Massachusetts Street. You can see a little stop sign maybe built in to 23rd Street there, looking east across Massachusetts Street. And of course the markers that identify Breesedale still today. A nice little section filled with bungalows and four squares in the 1930s. To the east of Breesedale was Haskell Institute, shown here. And look at the area around it, the old section lines and quarter section lines to the west of it. But you can see housing popping up to its west as well in the 1930s. It's not sitting out there by itself like it was in the 1890s. This is a view along 23rd Street. I keep pushing the wrong buttons here. Let's go back. This is a view along 23rd Street looking east toward Kansas City. And the little Sinclair station shown on the right there is a place where you can find vintage automobiles today. But you can see that 23rd Street is graded, and that's about it. If we look to the west along 23rd Street, and the cross street there is Haskell, you can see the hill that rises up above it. Institute, it would be to the left in the picture. It had an entirely different character and flavor and was out on the fringe, of course, between the wars. So by the 1940s, the downtown was fully developed. It ran from 6th to 14th without interruption. It was closely linked to the neighborhoods that surrounded it, and the whole arrangement had a real Midwestern small town feel to it. The next important period is what you would call, I guess, the post-war boom, 1946 to 1963. And like other cities, Lawrence grew after World War II. New industries, an enlarged student population, and an increased demand for housing pushed the growth, but it was geographically contained to the existing frame of highways that bounded Lawrence. We can't understate the importance of the highways in framing Lawrence, in guiding its growth, and in giving it a certain look and shape. The post-war developments reinforced the northern and southern edges of the highway grid. By that I mean they reinforced 6th Street, added to its growth, and reinforced 23rd Street, added to its growth as well. This is a diagram, and it's found in Pete Shortridge's book called Kaw Valley Landscapes, and it shows that highway frame that I'm talking about, the little rectangle that surrounds the built-up part of Lawrence during the post-war boom. On the north, 6th Street, 23rd Street on the south, Iowa. On the west, Massachusetts Street on the east. This served, as I said, as a framework for the growth right after the war. During the post-war years, this map, or growth, focused pretty much on 6th Street and 23rd Street, but as well on the area between 19th and 23rd Street, south of the campus, and on the Hillcrest area to the northwest of campus. Again, this is another one of those maps that's not too easy to make out, but the areas I'm talking about for those of you who aren't as familiar with Lawrence are these. Commercial development along here on 6th Street, more commercial development along here on 23rd, residential development here south of Allen Fieldhouse, west and a little bit east of Naismith Drive, and then up here, the Hillcrest area and just west beyond the Hillcrest Shopping Center. Those were important nodes or foci of growth between 1946 and 1963. And they're very, very critical, again, in reshaping the landscape of Lawrence. And I think what I'd like to do at this point is, rather than go further with the discussion of how the built environment of Lawrence changed between the end of World War II and today, I think it might be valuable to save those comments and to use them a little bit later on in the course as an intro to what Professor Domer is going to say about the development of West Lawrence and specifically about the Albemarle area and the Albemarle Golf Course, because it's the events of the 50s and 60s that really precipitate that growth that took place west of Iowa Street. What I'd like to do is jump to a very quick conclusion and talk for just a minute about sources that are critical in studying the early history of Lawrence's built environment. That early model that I showed you that shows typical patterns of urban development, without going back to that, let me just say this. Very simply, where does Lawrence fit in on that? I think Lawrence made it by about the 1960s to that point that we would call the automobile area, where it expanded considerably. And I think beginning at the end of the 1960s into the 1990s, Lawrence jumped past what we would call a period where most large cities grew and jumped right to what is today an edge city period. If we talked about the power centers that have developed at 31st in Iowa and some of the other subdivisions that have grown up out near Wakarusa, west of Castle, we're starting to fit a pattern that's already preceded us in Johnson County, and that is the future for Lawrence. The future, I suppose, is already here. So, as I said, we have a pretty predictable future ahead of us. By constructing the South Lawrence Trafficway, I think we are constructing the outer beltway for Lawrence that's going to put us, again, on the same path that Johnson County has followed for the last 15 to 20 years. Not that there's anything good or bad about it. I'm just saying that the built environment of Lawrence is a fairly predictable thing at this point. We're following patterns that have taken place elsewhere. I think, again, to jump ahead a little bit, and these are things we'll talk about later on, the cautionary note that I want to say about the built environment that was created before World War II that was constructed for a town is very different than the built environment that's created after World War II in Lawrence, which is really created for a city and a suburban subdivision. And those are two very, very different places, two very, very different worlds, two very different Lawrences. The Lawrence I remember from going to school here in the early 60s, or late 60s and early 70s is very, very different from what I see coming back to Lawrence in the 1990s. And I realize when I talk to people about the Lawrence I remember, I'm describing a place that's very different from what most of them might be experiencing today. So my cautionary note is this. I think growth is good, but we have to keep in mind the need to balance new construction and the inclusion of franchise businesses from outside Lawrence that bring us the things that we can find in other places, with the retention, the preservation, and the restoration of those things, houses and businesses as well, that retain and keep that early identity, that remind us of Lawrence's past, remind us of the small college town that existed here between World War I and World War II, that I think really flavor and identity. We're not on the right slide tray right now for this, but I will tell you, there are fantastic photographic collections at the Kansas collection at Spencer Library. I encourage you to go look at those. The Duke d'Ambra collection is fantastic. You've seen some of the materials tonight. David Derry and Steve Jansen's book, Pictorial History of Lawrence, has many fine photographs. Katie Armitage's book, 19th Century Houses of Lawrence, is fantastic, as is Pete Shortridge's Caw Valley Landscapes and several other books on East Lawrence. There's a good amount of material that treat the built environment history of Lawrence. I encourage you to look it over and examine some of those images. So, thank you. I will stop after only 2 carousels rather than 3.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swann. With that, we end our second film portion for this session.